Okay, guys, let's do the last little bit here, which is graphing a reflection. In this case, an x-axis reflection. But we're not really going to think of it so much as an x-axis reflection as we're going to think of it as a reflection over the midline. Okay, so notice we've got both a vertical translation and a horizontal. Well, I want to deal with the vertical first. So remember, if it's out wide like that, that's a vertical shift up 3. So usually my x-axis here is the midline. But if it's shifted up 3, I want to put that midline in first. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, and that's the line y equal to 3. And we call that our midline. Okay, then, well, now we've got to shift how? Well, pi halves which direction? Well, it's minus pi halves, and the minus is built into the equation, so that should be pi halves to the right. So instead of starting at 0, I'm going to go ahead and just call this pi halves here. Okay, then of course my amplitude is 5. There's my x-axis reflection. And let's do now our period. Vertical shift, horizontal shift. Okay, and our horizontal shift is sometimes called a phase shift. We'll talk more about that as we go forward. Okay. So period. Again, period 2 pi over the absolute value of b. Well, b is found here in front of x. And there's nothing there. Okay, so we assume it's a 1. So period is 2 pi over 1, which is 2 pi. Okay, so ordinarily, if I had a period of 2 pi, I'd just come on out here and say that's 2 pi, and I'd construct it. But I have to keep in mind that my starting point was here at pi halves. So I'm actually going to add that 2 pi to pi halves. So whatever my period length is, I'm going to add to my starting point. Okay, and notice I began by drawing my midline. I started with that vertical shift. Okay, so what's pi halves plus 2 pi? Well, I've got to multiply that by 2 over 2. So that'd be pi halves plus 4 pi halves, which is 5 pi halves. So I know that at the end of the period, that should be 5 pi halves. Okay. All right, then what do I do now? How do I find my... Well, I have to take it and break it into 4 equal parts. And notice I'm doing this along my midline and not my x-axis, because I've shifted it up by 3. Okay, so I've got my starting value of pi halves, and I know where it finishes, 5 pi halves, because I added 2 pi to it, which was my period length. Well, what do we do next? Well, we take 2 pi and divide it in how many pieces? You got it, 4 pieces, 4 equal pieces. 2 pi divided by 4, pi halves. So this is the amount I'm going to add to where? Well, back here to my starting amount each time. Okay, so let me erase a little of this, clear a little of it out. So remember, if I were at 0, I'd just do 0 plus pi halves, and then I'd add pi halves to it again. But I'm not at 0. I have this phase shift of pi halves to the right. So we're going to add to our starting location that pi halves we found as the quarter part of our period here when we divided our period in 4. Okay, so pi halves plus pi halves would be 2 pi halves, which is pi. So pi. And then I'm going to add pi halves to it again. Well, pi is the same. If I multiply by 2 over 2, that would be 2 pi halves plus pi halves is 3 pi halves. 3 pi halves. And then I'm going to add pi halves to it again, which would be 4 pi halves or 2 pi. Okay. Once we've done that, we're just going to erase and we're going to go to our XY table. So let's do that. Okay, so notice we're kind of following a general pattern here. We're identifying our transformations. We're starting with the vertical shift and drawing the new midline if we have it. Then if we have a horizontal shift, we're accounting for that. Then we're dealing with, say, the amplitude in the period. And once I have the period, I have to divide it into 4 parts. And whatever that 4th part is, I'm going to add to whatever my starting value is each time until I have all my locations. Okay, so we're getting close here now. Now we want to do the XY table. And of course, I'm going to do pi halves, pi, 3 pi halves, 2 pi, and 5 pi halves. Okay, let's do g of pi halves. Well, that's -5 sine of pi halves minus pi halves plus 3. Okay, pi halves minus pi halves. 0. What's the sign of 0? Well, I think 0 on the unit circle. That's 1 comma 0. Sign corresponds to y, so that's 0. Multiplied by -5 is 0 plus 3 is 3. Okay. Let me erase and let's evaluate our next point. Okay, g of pi. Well, that'll be -5 sine of pi minus pi halves plus 3. Well, pi minus pi halves leaves me with pi halves. Then I think sine of pi halves. Well, sine of pi halves, that's a 90, so that's going to be the y value at a 90, that's 1. Multiplied by -5 plus 3. -5 plus 3, -2. Okay, let's erase. All right, let's do g of 3 pi halves. -5 sine of 3 pi halves minus pi halves plus 3. Well, what's 3 pi halves minus pi halves? 2 pi halves, which is pi. Well, sine of pi, sine corresponds to y, and at that 180 there, that's a 0 on y. 0 plus 3 is 3. Okay, and let's evaluate again. G of 2 pi is next. Negative 5 sine of 2 pi minus pi halves plus 3. Well, what's 2 pi minus pi halves? Well, I have to multiply that by 2 over 2, and that'll give me 4 pi halves minus pi halves, which is 3 pi halves. Okay, the sine of 3 pi halves would be the y value at 3 pi halves, which is negative 1. So negative 5 times negative 1 plus 3. 5 plus 3 is 8. Okay, and of course we'd evaluate our last point. Okay, so when I evaluated that last location, 5 pi halves, I came out with the value of 3. Okay, and then I went ahead and plotted all my points. Let's now draw the shape. And sorry, that should go right through there. Okay, so notice we've got a sine graph, but what happened? Well, instead of it opening upwards as typical, it opens downwards. Well, why is that? Well, that's the influence of this x-axis reflection. Okay, so instead of it, say, opening upwards, it's going to open downwards. And then it's going to do the complete cycle. And that's one full period of it from pi halves to 5 pi halves. Okay, so the process is pretty similar with all of these. We go through identifying what the transformations are. Always identify the vertical shift first, and then we deal with the horizontal shift, and then we get into the amplitude period. And of course, the x-axis reflection should play itself out once we've made our xy table and evaluated points. Remember, our knowledge of the unit circle is going to help us graph these as we go. Okay, so I hope you found these videos helpful as you work through the problems in this section. Thank you.